But once again, I must enlist your sympathy by reminding you of the impossibility of stepping outside of the system of consciousness, so that on this meta level, we are all subject to mind blindness. And this brings to mind actually a story that's popular with general semanticists of all ages, the story of the blind man and the elephant. As you may recall, the story has one blind man touching the elephant's trunk and saying it's a snake, another touches its tail and says it's a rope, another touches a leg and says it's a tree, and so on. Each one only senses a part of the whole, and so they argue about what the true nature of the elephant really is. And for us, consciousness is the 6-ton elephant in our room, and there's no way to get him out of there. And it may be that the many conceptions of consciousness that I've gone over are bits and pieces of some larger whole that we're unable to fully grasp, some phenomena that exists in more dimensions than we can perceive. There's no way to know, of course, and so I return to the futility of my task and recall the words of Ecclesiastes, vanity, all is vanity. And perhaps I ought to give up at this point, but I did promise Alan I'd talk about these things. And I'm reminded of Paul Watzlawic's book title, The Situation is Hopeless but Not Serious. Indeed, considering tonight that my people celebrate how Moses led the Israelites out of servitude in Egypt, it doesn't seem to be all that serious a matter to lead the general semanticists through some thoughts about consciousness. So let me now suggest some basic points to consider. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that consciousness is not a thing. We think of it as a thing because the word consciousness is a noun. The fact that Indo-European languages such as English are especially noun-oriented was made clear a long time ago by Benjamin Lee Whorf in his study of the Native American Hopi. As he put it, I quote from Whorf, "Hopi, with its preferences for verbs as contrasted to our own liking for nouns, perpetually turns our propositions about things into propositions about events." So, for example, our word lightning is a noun, and essentially we think of lightning as a thing, whereas the Hopi would speak of lightning as a verb and an event. And they would be right. Lightning is not an object, it's not a substance, it's a dynamic process, a happening, the movement of electrical energy across the sky. But if you have this mistaken idea that lightning is a thing, you might just think that you could catch it, capture it, control it, manipulate it. And you might just get some old fool like Benjamin Franklin going out in a thunderstorm to catch lightning in a bottle. And that bottle becomes Thomas Edison's light bulb and John Ambrose Fleming's vacuum tube and Jack Kilby and Roger Noyce's silicon computer chip. Sometimes the wrong map can take us into important new territory, as Christopher Columbus could tell you. On a personal note, one evening when my son was about 3 years old, he looked out the window and said to me, "It's darking out. It's darking out." And I said to myself, "Oh my God, my son's a Hopi." But once the initial shock wore off, I realized that his linguistic creativity brought him closer to reality than my own use of nouns such as dusk and evening. Languages give us maps to guide us, but they do not dictate how we will navigate. Moreover, the maps can be redrawn through linguistic invention, which is exactly what general semantics tries to do. For example, through techniques such as the elimination of the verb to be. So let's redraw our mental maps by thinking of consciousness as something we do rather than something we have. Consider the words of Buckminster Fuller as he self-reflexively considered his own consciousness. He wrote, "I live on earth at present and I don't know what I am. I know that I am not a category. I am not a thing, a noun. I seem to be a verb." So I ask you to keep in mind that consciousness is a verb, but at the same time to retain the option of treating consciousness as if it were a noun. There's a certain utility in mistaking it for a thing if we want to catch lightning in a bottle or catch a glimpse of the burning bush. So understanding consciousness as an event and a dynamic process rather than a steady state, it then becomes possible to view it as an ecology of mind, to use Gregory Bateson's happy phrase. This means that we can view consciousness as a system, And according to the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, the system of consciousness is made up of interdependent parts, and those interdependent parts are thoughts. Thoughts are what make up consciousness. In other words, we don't begin with a fully formed consciousness, but rather with individual thoughts. As our thoughts become fruitful and multiply, we lose mental equilibrium and move toward the edge of chaos until consciousness as a system emerges. We begin by thinking, thoughts proliferate, and we start thinking about thinking. In this way, consciousness emerges and gives us the means by which we may manage, organize, and perhaps control our own thought processes. In referring to thought here, I want to make it clear that I'm not only talking about rational ideas. Instead, I take as my authority the great philosopher of symbolic forms, Susanne Langer. She argued that human symbolic activity has as much, if not more, to do with feeling than with reason. For Langer, thought is not just a product of discursive symbols such as words, but also presentational symbols such as pictures. She would have recognized that Temple Grandin engages in a different but equally valid type of symbolic activity in her thought processes. Moreover, Langer explained that presentational forms begin with the senses, that the activity of perception is also a symbolic activity. In general semantics, we understand that perception is the first rung up on the abstraction ladder, that we abstract or pull out of the world some of the sensory data from all that's available. And then our nervous systems process the information and create mental images, theories, or maps of the world. And through this active process, we construct a view of the world as orderly, stable, consistent, predictable. This view is pure illusion, of course, the reality being a chaos that we cannot live with, or at least not and retain our sanity, so our senses filter out a large part of the data we take in, and the part that remains stands for the whole. Out of that limited form of chaos, we construct a worldview, and this parallels the emergence of consciousness from chaotic thought patterns. Of course, we don't actually process data from the outside world, you know this. Rather, outside stimulation excites or irritates various nerve endings, causing them to transmit electrochemical signals through the system and on up to the brain. The process is the same when we register internal sensations such as a headache, back pain, or leg cramp. While we tend to speak of the five senses of sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste, biologists also note the presence of such internal senses as the proprioceptive, which tells us about the movement and position of our joints and muscles, and the vestibular sense, our sense of balance, of gravity, of movement and position in relation to the earth. In fact, without proper development of the internal, intentional forms of perception, we have trouble developing our external senses. As well, we have trouble with our thought processes and ultimately with our own consciousnesses. That dichotomy between mind and senses, thought and perception, logic and empiricism is a false one. In the end, external perception and internal feeling, reason and emotion, all are based on neural activity on the nervous system as information processor. The nervous system is close to being a closed system, which always freaks me out whenever I think about it, so we try not to, but it's pretty much closed off. And it requires that closure in order to allow a worldview and a consciousness to form within. If it were any more open, too much chaos would come in, and consciousness would not be able to organize itself. But by the same token, the nervous system is not and could never be an entirely closed system. It needs that limited amount of chaos to allow for growth and increasing complexity. And while our sense of being in contact with the outside world, in direct contact, is a false consciousness, it's still true that our perceptions are a response to outside stimuli, a reflection of the world. Even if they're just shadows on the cave wall, they're directly and immediately connected to what's going on out there, to what they represent, to objective reality. As complexity theorists Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela put it, we are structurally coupled with the world. So perception as a form of thought is part of what gives rise to consciousness, and it guarantees that consciousness is not entirely a closed system. That's why the situation is hopeless, but not serious.